Hey students, I'm glad you're here for our Tuesday lesson on a Wednesday this week. But either way, I know that most of our small groups are meeting tonight and some are meeting on Friday. So I'm glad that you're able to make it, glad we are able to hang out a little bit. And I hope that you are involved in our reading plan right now. I hope that you've been reading along with us. Man, this week we got into Joshua. We're having a blast in week 11. Joshua 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and then 23 and 24 this morning. Just good stuff as we go through and see God being faithful to his promises, right? As he led his people out of Egypt, he told them he was going to take them to a promised land. They made some mistakes along the way. They got that time pushed back a little bit, but they ended up making it. Another thing I want you to be on the lookout for as we kind of dive into our lesson in just a second, we're going to have a worship video dropping this week that I'm so excited about. We were able to, just through the beauty of technology, connect a few of our different student worship team members, and we're working on a video right now they're going to be able to lead us in worship on social media, and I'm so excited about that. So be on the lookout for that. Before the end of this week, we'll have that posted. That being said, grab a Bible, turn to Deuteronomy 34. Deuteronomy 34. Today's message is coming out of week 10 because that's what we read last week. So Pastor Norm preached out of Deuteronomy on Sunday. He preached out of something from last week, and this week, today, I'm going to be speaking on something from Deuteronomy as well, because we're doing this thing where we read one week, and then the next week, Pastor Noel will preach on it, and I will preach on it as well. And so this week, we're looking at our message from week 10 in Deuteronomy 34. Last week, we were in Numbers 13 and 14. If you tuned in for that, we were talking about two basic concepts that they weren't earth-shattering. You're probably walking away thinking like, Jeff, why do you even have a job at the church? I already knew those things. But I hope they challenged you in a new and fresh way. That if God's going somewhere, go. And if God's not going somewhere, don't go, right? It's such a simple thing, but we neglect that so often. We forget that. We throw that concept aside and we do our own thing and we go where God's not leading us. And when God starts to lead us somewhere, we don't go. We're not obedient. And so that simple concept out of Numbers 13 and 14, if God's leading you somewhere, go. If God's not leading you somewhere, don't go. But today, I'm going to share a little bit out of something that's really been stepping on my toes. If you tuned into the Hangout on Thursday night, shameless self-plug there, on Thursday nights at 6 o'clock we had the LTC Hangout where you can check in with us and just see what's going on with Living Truth Church. You can see what the future holds for us, what kind of plans we've got, how groups and D groups and ministries are going, and also just hear a little word about what God's been speaking to each of us as we're going through the Word of God. But that being said, if you tuned in last Thursday, you heard a little bit about what I'm going to talk about tonight. It's one thing that the Lord's really used to challenge me in my motivations in doing things. But I want us to start by remembering a moment. This is going to set everything up. A week and a half ago, Pastor Norm preached out of Numbers 20, if you remember that. And it's a passage that tells the story of Moses losing everything that he'd hoped and dreamed for his adult life. Everything that he'd worked for, his life goal was crushed in one poor decision. See, Moses had been put on a mission by God to lead his people, God's people, the Israelites, out of Egypt and into the Promised Land. And for him, the goal was to reach the Promised Land, right? It was this beautiful land flowing with milk and honey, supposed to be an incredible place to live. God had prepared it especially for them. And he'd seen the Israelites in captivity. He'd heard their cries. He'd seen the way that they were treated. And he'd heard God's promises that one day he would give them this incredible land and that would be theirs. It would be their land to inhabit. They'd no longer be slaves. They'd be free and they would occupy this land. And this was his mission. This was Moses' mission to lead these people out. This was his goal, and to one day reach this promised land and live life there. But one day, Moses was given instructions by God to handle a situation in a specific way. If you remember, the Israelites were groaning and grumbling and complaining about not having water like they typically did, and they weren't trusting God. They were ready to, they didn't want Moses as a leader. They didn't want to be following God. They wanted to go back to Egypt, like all these crazy things. Like they wanted to be slaves again. And God tells Moses to say, hey, look, go out and speak to this rock and water will come forth. And God had already done this one time. He told Moses, go strike the rock and water will come forth. This time he tells Moses, go speak to the rock and water is going to come forth. And Moses, whether it was out of frustration or anger or thirst or whatever his reasoning was, maybe it was even out of habit, who knows? Whatever his motivation was, he disobeyed God when God said to speak to the rock, and Moses struck the rock 2 times. God still brought water forth, but because of Moses' disobedience, God told Moses, you will never step foot in the promised land. Now think about that for a moment. What are the biggest dreams that you have for your life? What are your grandest aspirations? What are you working for? What do you want a family and kids one day? Do you just want like the typical American dream kind of situation? That's a great dream to have. Do you have a dream job in mind? Do you want to work in a big city for a big organization? Do you want to be a missionary one day? Do you want to be a professional athlete or musician? Do you want to have money and cars and a really nice house? Like, what are the dreams that you have for your life? What are your greatest goals, your dreams, your aspirations? Think about that. And imagine if God was leading you in that direction. If God said, hey, this is what I have for you. I'm going to give you this dream that you have. I'm going to lead you in that direction. That's where you're headed if you are on track with me. And one day you make one poor decision and God takes that away from you. This one thing that you've been working for your entire life that God told you that you would have, that you were working your way towards, one poor decision and God takes it away. You'd be shattered. You would be absolutely crushed. You'd want to give up. And that leads me to my question for you today. If you were faced with that situation, if you were in that scenario, if God told you, hey, I will give you this thing that you're working for, this thing that you want, that it's your dream, it's your biggest dream for your life. And you make one decision, you ruin all of it. God tells you that's no longer the plan for you. You're never going to get there. What would you do? Would you still lead well? Would you still pursue God? Would you still trust in Him as your Lord and Savior, as the director of your life? Because that's what Moses did. He continued to lead the people of God even after God took away this dream that he'd had for his life. He continued to pursue Him. We're going to look at Deuteronomy 34. It says, Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim, Manasseh, all the land of Judah, as far as the western sea, the Negeb and the plain that is the valley of Jericho, and the city of the palm trees, as far as Zor. And the Lord said to him, This is the land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. I will give it to your offspring. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley of the land of Moab opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. And the people of the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. I read that because it shows where Moses was at the time of his death. A good while after he made this mistake, a good while after his hopes and dreams were taken away from him because of the mistake that he made, the decision that he made. But he had still led well to the point that God personally buried Moses. I think that says a lot about the relationship between God and Moses. God personally buried him when he died. But also, God showed him so much grace by bringing him to this point where he could see the land. He said, look, this was your punishment. You can't go into the land. I told you that, and I'm faithful. But I will show you this land, and you're going to see this. I'm going to let you know your descendants are going to inhabit this land. It's a beautiful land, and it's going to be theirs. And so God showed him this grace in that moment of showing him the land that he'd prepared for him, that Moses had been working for and aspiring to live in his entire life and aspiring to lead his people into. He continued to lead the people of God even though there was no earthly reward. He knew there was nothing that he was going to get out of the leadership that he was leading, the leadership that he was showing his people. He knew there was nothing earthly that was going to come out of that. And he continued to lead well. If you were told that there would be no earthly reward in your life, would you still follow the Lord? If you were told that it didn't matter how well you ran the race, no matter how well you did everything that you felt like God was telling you to do, if you were told that there's no earthly reward for you, would you still pursue Jesus? Would you still lead well? Would you still follow Him well? Or would you give up? Because that's what faith looks like. Hebrews 11:1 says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." Faith looks like living for the Lord regardless of what you think you could receive on earth. A lot of people have these ideas that if they chase after God hard enough, He'll give them these blessings and He'll give them these riches and He'll give them healing. And God never tells us that He's going to give us those things. God never tells us that we're going to get all these different earthly blessings for following Him. And sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Sometimes God blesses us immensely. And there's many people that I know of, Christian people, people that love the Lord, that are pursuing God with everything they have, and they have nothing. God doesn't promise us riches because of our faith. God promises us an eternity in heaven, and we can have hope in that. We can have hope in the future things to come when we leave this earth and move into the heavenly realms, right? Whenever we are with Him in the heavenlies. That's what we can have hope for. That's what Moses had hope for. That was his motivation. He wasn't motivated by the promised land. He was motivated by pursuing God. He was motivated by living a life for God. Faith looks like living for the Lord regardless of what you think you could receive on earth. I've been wrestling through this. I'm telling you, I've been wrestling through it. The Lord has been working on me because I think I do a lot of the right things. But do I do them for the right reasons? I try to do the right thing a lot, and I think you do too, but there's times where I think maybe I do the right thing because I want approval. Maybe I do the right thing because I want to just pursue excellence because I want to be good at stuff, right? Or maybe I do the right thing because I want people to tell me I did a good job or to see it or whatever, but am I doing the right thing because Jesus wants me to do the right thing? And am I doing the right thing to glorify Him? And because I'm working in the direction of the reward that I will receive in heaven. And that's just what's been really working on me. And I want to ask you, what is your motivation for the life that you live as you follow Christ? And I want to encourage you, don't just stop where you're at and stop pursuing because you feel like you've got the wrong motivation, but let's just shift our focus. Shift your focus to the one that we're living for, the one that we're living our lives for and we're pursuing, rather than for the things of this earth. I hope you guys have a great conversation surrounding this in your small groups. I look forward each week to hearing reports from your small groups and the conversations that you guys have. I can't wait till we can meet together again. But until then, guys, I'm praying for you and I love you guys, and we'll hopefully see you soon.